Okay, so hi, I'm Justin. Very nice to meet you all. So I want to present on the topic of on the Neurophenomenology of Crisis, and I want to jump straight in with a quote by Tietjen, who was recently offered a Phenomenology of Crisis. And she writes, "Crises violently disrupt our ordinary way of being in the world and being together through putting into question what we ordinarily take for granted and confronting us with a threat to core values of our individual or collective existence." And I think that this can, in a sense, be taken as programmatic to the study of crisis. But I want to take this statement, this notion of disruption, and I want to look at it not only from the phenomenological perspective, but also from an additional neurocognitive perspective, which then can be synthesized into what I here term a neurophenomenology of crisis. So I will begin first with the phenomenology of crisis and walk through a couple of succinct of steps that I think lay out central aspects of that, and then I will cross over to the neurocognitive perspective and then bring these together in the last part. I want to begin in particular with an author that I think is quite crucial to understanding the notion of crisis as a life-world disruption, and that's Nicholas Complides, who takes up Heideggerian disclosure terminology. And he writes specifically, world disclosure refers at one level to the disclosure of an already interpreted, symbolically structured life world, the world in which we always already find ourselves. And I guess that this, as phenomenologists, this is a perfectly ordinary statement to you. What is interesting here is that Complides already points to the idea that this pre-interpreted life world is only one sense of disclosure. The other, of course, is that of disruption and redisclosure, the enlargement of horizon of meaning. And I think that another author who really drills into that is Bernhard Waldenfels, who writes, "This simultaneous selection and exclusion leads to the fact that there are particular orders but not a single order. This contingency of bounded orders forms the precondition for the existence of strangeness that escapes the grasp of the respective order." And so I think that from a phenomenological perspective, the first thing that we can see is that crisis is, in a sense, preconditioned or predetermined by the interplay of order and chaos. The very fact that we live in what we consider a normal world, a structured world in which everything seems normal to us, is in a sense a precondition for the fact that something can happen that can violently disrupt that and that can plunge us into an extended period of crisis. And so Waldenfels offers this very useful concept of so-called pathos, and he writes, "The old world pathos seems appropriate to me for events that happen to us, befall us, overcome us, surprise us, assail us." And what I think is good about this is that he points to the idea that the disruption of a life where it doesn't just occur from one moment to the next as a total disruption, but the first thing that happens is an anomalous occurrence. Something happens that doesn't quite fit into the pre-interpreted structure, and that, in a sense, alerts us to the sense that something has gone wrong, or that something has changed. And I think that in this sense, it's also important to differentiate between anomalies that don't represent crises. Sometimes something happens and we think, well, what on earth is going on? And it turns out that this is actually something that furthers our projects. And I think one contribution that's really important here is written by Sophie Grace Chappelle, who wrote this article Introducing Epiphanies, where she talks about moments where something happens that's strange, but that immediately kind of clicks, and we think, oh, well, sure, I have to integrate this into my world understanding. For example, if you're writing a paper and suddenly everything sort of falls into place, that's an epiphany, right? And crisis is, in a sense, the absolute opposite of that. It's a pathos, some kind of anomalous event that we don't have any response to, that disrupts our life world in a fashion that we are unable to comprehend, and that leaves us adrift in this kind of sea of overcomplexity. And there's another Waldenfelsian concept that really spells this out very well. It's pathos without response, and it's been thematized by Summa, so we'll point to Summa in this specific case. She writes, "The disruption of the ability to respond corresponds to an experience of being overwhelmed, which manifests itself in phenomena such as shock, helplessness, and speechlessness in the case of traumatization." So it's this very idea of being speechless in the face of a pathic intrusion of anomaly that can be distinguished as the core feature of crisis, or the core phenomenological aspect of crisis. At least that's what I argue here. And so this, I think, is the central core of the phenomenological facet of this presentation. We have a normal life, we have an anomaly, we cannot respond to this anomaly, and that entails a period of crisis in which we're adrift in this kind of inability to integrate a novel world understanding. And so the question is, how do we ever move out of that? And I think Nicholas Complides, to whom I pointed in the very beginning, he terms the second order disclosure, and I think that's quite useful. But what is really at stake are, I think, two separate things. On the one hand, we have what is perhaps quite day-to-day kind of formulation of this. In Werner Stegmaier's What is Orientation, he writes, unfamiliar circumstances in a new situation become familiar if one orients oneself about them. I mean, this is in a sense self-evident, but it's quite complex if you think about it in practice. What it really means is that in order to overcome a moment of crisis, we have to explore the situation, we have to find novel, what he calls footholds, and we have to reinterpret the world in a way that then allows us to act again in it, and in this way to overcome crisis. But there's also a very strong normative component, which I can't focus on here today, which is present in both Completus as well as Waldenfels, such that Completus writes, it is here in this gap between who we have been and who we might be that we see our own freedoms at stake, and here where we might find it manifested. So the idea is that specifically because crisis disrupts our ability to act in the world, it is also the place in which our freedom is at stake. And by redisclosing the world in a manner that integrates an anomaly and that allows us to move forward again, we are, in a sense, able to establish or actualize a higher self, an improved self, in a sense. Of course, this is the optimal case, right? It's possible that a crisis occurs, it wallops you, and then you have no way of recovering, right? You're done, you die, basically. So this is quite harsh, but this is the optimal case, where you're able to redisclose the world in a manner that is then perhaps better and more sophisticated than before. Okay, so this is the basic phenomenological structure. Now I want to turn to what I think is the neurocognitive correlation to that. And I think that there are, in a sense, two possible ways of approaching this. One is, or two sets of literature that allow one to do that. The first is a cluster of literature that I think can be connected to someone called Kiewerstein, who writes, What is a Heideggerian cognitive science? And then there's this whole set of literature, which we broadly know as the 4E cognitive science literature, that in a sense spells out facets of world disclosure from a cognitive science perspective, but that stays, in a sense, very closely rooted in phenomenology. And central contributions are, for example, James Schulkin, Johnson. Kiewerstein himself has also developed anticipatory models of consciousness that all go into this direction. But the set of literature that I want to focus on in this paper is, I think, less known in phenomenology, and perhaps that's why I think it's quite interesting. It starts from the basic premise. It asks the very same question that Kiewerstein also asks. Hirsch writes, how then can we understand the horizon of interpretation within the context of contemporary cognitive science? So it's basically the same question. What is the Heideggerian cognitive science, or how can we take the notion of a horizon of interpretation, the notion of world disclosure, and translate that into a cognitive science framework? And then there's this whole set of contributions that all reference one another and that all spell out very similar facets, which emerged in the last decade that spell out aspects of this. I want to start again now with the notion of a normal life situation. And the idea here is that we operate on very specific neural circuitry as long as the world is unfolding in a way that we think is normal. Specifically, this is associated with the cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal neural cortex, such that Peterson in Maps of Meaning writes, when nothing is going wrong, the cortical systems expressly responsible for the organization and implementation of goal-directed behavior remain firmly in control. So there's this distinct set of goal-oriented action that is mediated by a very specific set of neural circuitries that is operative when the world is unfolding as it does. And again, here there is a notion of world disclosure at play, but one that is much less focused on social reproduction, but one on goal-oriented activity. The notion of world disclosure in this particular set of literature is translated into goal-oriented action. The world is rendered meaningful to us as long as we are able to act in it and as long as we are pursuing a particular goal. And this then can then be counter-distinguished to a situation of crisis. And here I want to draw on a very specific paper titled Psychological Entropy, a Framework for Understanding Uncertainty-Related Anxiety. And the reason why this particular paper is so interesting is because it takes the notion of uncertainty-related or crisis-related experience and it translates it into, or it correlates it with very specific neural circuitry. Uncertainty, they say, can here be understood psychologically in terms of the conflicting actions and perceptions that can potentially be brought to bear on a given situation. And so in this notion of uncertainty that is employed in this paper, there's already existent this notion of a life world destabilized, the issue that we suddenly have many more interpretations available to us than we initially thought. I think perhaps a good example is you have a friend and you've always thought of this person as a friend, and suddenly, I don't know, there's a betrayal and you are no longer certain how to understand this person, right? And so a whole array of potential world understandings emerges that contradicts your initial supposition, and that, according to this paper, then produces a very specific set of neurocircuitries to spring into action. Of course, I'm personally not a neuroscientist. I don't think that the important thing is to really go deeply into which concrete neurocircuitries I play here, but to recognize that what is happening is actually a shift in embodiment, a shift in your entire organism that corresponds to the emergence of crisis. However, if we want to focus on this neurological dimension, the authors write the BIS, the behavioral inhibition system, which is associated with the hippocampus and the so-called anterior cingulate cortex, systems serve as the neural substrate for the experience of uncertainty, which is associated in part with the subjective state of anxiety. And so the notion here is that once crisis emerges, there's a shift from the cortex to the limbic system with a noradrenaline release, which then means that we're operating in a completely different set of neurocircuitries, which means that we're in a heightened state of energy expenditure, so it's very physiologically stressful being in a state of crisis. And secondly, there's this constant component or mood of anxiety that permeates all crisis, right? And so you're in a sense unable to find respite in the world as long as you're under this influence of the anxiety circuitry. Another point that they emphasize is that when you're in this state constantly, when you experience what they call tonic levels of noradrenaline, then your organism wears down to quite a significant extent. So you might see somebody that has been somehow traumatized in their past, and they haven't been able to integrate this experience, and so their whole organism is in a sense worn down by this experience, and they're unable to redisclose the world in a way that would make it habitable for them. Okay. Next, I want to then move to the notion of a redisclosure of the world. So assuming that we've once again not been completely, we haven't been killed by a crisis, perhaps there's the possibility of then finding or re-establishing a world disclosure that allows us to reassume life. How is that done specifically? I want to point to two contributions here, specifically to de Young's The Neuromodulator of Exploration, Unifying Theory of the Role of Dopamine in Personality, and another one called Meaning and the Rise of Interpretation, How Goals Structure Our Experience of the World. What de Young does is he focuses on the notion in which dopamine is a neuromodulator that works in counterposition to noradrenaline. So whereas noradrenaline ceases your behavior, dopamine allows you to once again approach a situation, even if the situation has become problematized in some way. So your brain releases dopamine, and this allows you to approach something, even if that is experienced as somehow hurtful or dangerous. So de Young writes, the dopaminergic system appears to be largely organized around two classes of incentive motivation: the incentive reward value of the possibility of specific goal attainment, and the incentive reward value of the possibility of gains in information. Now this is a quite complex statement because it points to two things. Dopamine is on the one hand responsible for what we do in our ordinary life. We move towards goals, and that's where dopamine is always active. But it's also active specifically in the case when all we can get from a situation is information. When an anomaly has occurred, what we have to do is we have to mine that anomaly, that situation, for further information in order to be able to then re-establish a world understanding. And that is what dopamine allows us to do. And de Young and also Hirsch, they point to the sense in which there's thus a cycle going on. The cortical control over action is in crisis, it's ceased and it shifts to the limbic system, but dopamine is really that which re-establishes cortical control over action, that is rediscloses the world. And Hirsch writes, the horizon of interpretation can thus change rapidly as an individual adopts a different goal, altering the existential substrate from which meanings emerge. And so the idea here is that once we have this dopaminergically induced exploration, we are able to redisclose the world once we change our goals. We have to change the way that we see the world and that we act in the world if we want to reassume a novelly viable world interpretation. And I think it's really interesting here that these actually like neurocognitive or neurophysiological oriented researchers, they have this like very strong ontological dimension here, right? They say there's a shift in the existential substrate from which meanings emerge. So once you have a different goal, the world that you're interacting with is a different world. You're taking a different subset of reality and using that to then act in the world. Okay, so that's this last dimension where we perhaps are able to explore and then redisclose the world by adopting a novel goal. Okay, finally, I want to then synthesize that into what I think is a distinct model of the neurophenomenology of crisis. Just in terms of methodology, this is perhaps a somewhat recent research paradigm initially introduced by someone called Varela. And the aim here is to bridge the mind-body gap, specifically also for purposes of examining pathology. And Varela has a whole research paradigm. I think that the important thing to focus on here, at least for my presentation, is that what I'm trying to do is not reductive. I don't want to say, well, the experiential dimension can be fully reduced to the neurocognitive dimension. That doesn't give us anything. What's interesting is instead what Northrop and Tuba here call identifying the neurocorrelates of specific phenomena features of experience, right? So there's this attempt to match both of these. Of course, that raises multiple questions in the philosophy of mind. And I think that this can be done in the case of these specific vocabularies precisely because the notion of world disclosure is present in one way or another in both of them. On the phenomenological side, there's of course the notion of world disclosure in the sense of inactivism, in the sense that we enact our environments. But in the neurocognitive literature that I propose is relevant here, this notion is also introduced, albeit from a more action-oriented perspective. So what's going on here is perhaps something that Lafont calls, in reference to Heidegger, hermeneutic idealism, where we understand reality based upon frameworks of intelligibility that allow us to interpret the world. But we're not passive receivers of reality, but we actively construct reality through interpretation. And so given this fundamental shared axiom, I think that we can then identify particular correlates. Firstly, that's normal life. What completists would call a first-order disclosure, what Stegmaier thinks we experience as calm, reassured, and at ease. And from a cognitive science perspective, this is simply cortically mediated goal-oriented action that renders information intelligible. Then we have the moment of crisis, which Weidenfels describes in terms of pathos without response. We have shock, helplessness, and speechlessness. We are unable to act in the world because something has occurred that fundamentally disrupts the way that we hitherto understood it. From a neurocognitive perspective, this is the activation of the limbic system, specifically the hippocampus, the amygdala, which also interacts with the anterior cingulate cortex, and which is, in basic terms, which floods our brain with noradrenaline and makes us extremely wary of the environment. We experience the world very negatively, and our whole organism is worn down by the energy expenditure. And then finally, we have the moment of redisclosure, which Stegmaier calls, he terms it reorientation, so you reorient yourself in the world. From a Comprendisian perspective, this is in a sense the actualization of the pure potential that is reality. So you redisclose whatever matrix of reality you're currently operating in. And this can then be, from a cognitive science perspective, be described in terms of the dopaminergically motivated exploration, which, if successful, then allows you to reconstruct a cortically mediated world interpretation based upon action goals. And then, of course, this is a cyclical process where redisclosure and the normal life that emerges from it can then again be drawn into crisis. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.